Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. Between now and Christmas, we're taking a 40-day walk through the scriptures in our Take 5s. We're looking at every book of the Old Testament, and we're seeing how Jesus is revealed to us there. It's the greatest build-up to a Christmas there's ever been. No, not the Take 5s, we're not the greatest build-up, but the Old Testament is the greatest build-up to Christmas there has ever been. Over thousands of years, God revealed his Son in an ever-increasing way, building up the expectation, building up the excitement until Jesus was born to Mary in Bethlehem. And in the book of Leviticus, now that might not be a book that you spend a lot of time reading. It might not be a book where you would expect to find much about Jesus. But the book of Leviticus is remarkable in several ways. Did you know that the book of Leviticus contains more of the direct words of God than any other book in the Bible? In other words, if you look at who's speaking, is it a narrator telling what's happening? Is it a prophet? Is it a character in a story speaking? Or is it God speaking the direct word for word of his words out? And Leviticus has a greater percentage of the speech of God included in quotation marks as being directly spoken from God than any other book in the Bible. And, the wonderful thing, of course, is that Jesus is the Word of God. So Leviticus reminds us of Jesus in that respect, that Jesus is the one that brings us the direct representation of who God is. Jesus says, "You have seen me, you have seen the Father." The beginning of the book of Hebrews says that God spoke to us in past times through prophets and other ways, but now he has spoken to us directly through the revelation given in his Son. But not only is Leviticus a book that's filled with the direct word of God, but Leviticus contains record of so many sacrifices to God. There were so many sacrifices, and they're described in Leviticus, sometimes in minute detail. And if you're like me, it's sometimes hard for us to read them without our eyes starting to glaze over, trying to cope with all the details. But you know what that's saying? If you look at the big picture of the sacrifices in Leviticus, it's telling us this, that there was going to be one true sacrifice, Jesus on the cross, that would be the sacrifice of all sacrifices. And no one Old Testament sacrifice could adequately explain what Jesus was going to do. And so it actually took many sacrifices to cover all the different aspects of what Jesus did on the cross. But together, they let us know that the coming sacrifice, the promised sacrifice that they were to expect, was the greatest and ultimate sacrifice of all. Also in the book of Leviticus, you have the high priest, and how there was a high priest had to be appointed. And the high priest was imperfect. He was a man, a sinful man, and he had to go through all kinds of consecration. And of course, each generation, the high priest would die. They had to appoint another high priest. They had to appoint more priests. But Jesus is our great high priest. There's no need for any other priest to be appointed, because Jesus is our great high priest who connects us with God and stands between us and God and is the bridge over sin. The gap of sin is now bridged by Jesus being our great high priest, bridging the gap between us and God. But one more thing about the book of Leviticus is there's this beautiful picture of what we call the scapegoat. Now today we use that phrase when we're talking about somebody maybe being blamed for everything, blamed unfairly. But in the Old Testament, the picture of the scapegoat was a wonderful illustration of what Jesus would do when he came. Because they would choose two goats. They did this every year. And one of the goats would be killed as a sacrifice, and its blood would be sprinkled. And the sprinkling of the blood, God said it was an atonement. It was a covering up of the people's sin. Well, that speaks to us about Jesus, obviously. But it's the other goat I quickly want to mention. Because the other goat, it was taken outside the city, and the priests would lay their hands on the head of the goat, symbolically transferring the sin of Israel onto the goat. And then it would be driven off into the distance. And as the people stood there and watched this goat carry their sin off into the distance, they weren't just forgiven, they knew that they were forgiven. And that's the wonderful thing about Jesus as our scapegoat, is not just that he took our sacrifice upon himself and took our punishment and suffering upon himself, not just that he has purchased us for forgiveness, but we can know that we are forgiven. We can have an assurance of sins forgiven because of this beautiful picture of the scapegoat. You know, the book of Leviticus, it's not an easy book to read, but it's got some great revelations of Jesus in it. May God bless you today, and please join us again next time for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.